My name is Alex Berger. I'm a senior technical marketing engineer within the Meraki business unit focused on switching. But I do work on a number of cross-cutting functions when it comes to like security features. One of those I'll get into in quite a bit of detail here in a moment. So I want to start off going through kind of why I think we could do better when it comes to how we do security in the network and how we define policies. Move into how we can use Meraki devices to provide telemetry to external sources such as StealthWatch, ICE, and actually not StealthWatch anymore. I keep saying that and I got yelled at last time. It's Secure Network Analytics now. The same outcome. And then look at kind of how we can leverage the data there as well as tie it all together. And then hopefully you all have questions and I'll be happy to try to answer them. So why not keep doing what we've always done? I've been in networking for long enough, I guess, that I've seen networks that were a single/16 and customers were asking for how to upgrade, move into something a little bit more scalable. And a lot of the deployments were just because they turned the network up and they just added devices constantly. And then they started needing things like segmentation. And we used VLANs for that as a way to just do that layer 2 segmentation, keep things separate, QoS policies, you name it. I remember vividly trying to help a customer split out their voice VLAN from their data VLAN because they had some really old voice over IP phones and they did not like the amount of broadcast traffic they were seeing. And so, we started growing networks and adding more and more VLANs and then started adding in things like security and access lists. And we had many different ways to deploy these. You could deploy them on interfaces, SSIDs, SVIs, and they don't necessarily maintain themselves at all. And as you need to make changes, you have to add more and more lines to something that you have to then document, because if you don't document why you're building an access list, it becomes really hard to track down later. And as we add more networks, we have to add more and more access lists, and it becomes a difficult thing to manage and scale out. I worked on a couple projects back before I came to Cisco where we literally spent weeks going through ASAs and all of the lines of firewall policies to try to figure out what they were for. And 9 times out of 10, we didn't know, and we had to look and reset hit counters to try to figure out if they're still being used. I look back on those positively though, because I learned a lot about networking and how hard it is to actually keep track of stuff. And then when I started working further and further with customers, I started deploying things like Cisco ICE, and we started adding in authentication, authorization, putting policies on clients. And we started running into things like, how do I protect stuff within a VLAN? And when you look at intra-VLAN traffic, a lot of times that's kind of just given the Wild West, if you will. Anything can talk to anything within that subnet. You can't apply policies. It becomes cumbersome. It's like per port. And then you have things, if you don't apply those policies, like an IoT device that gets manipulated by someone and then it spreads throughout the network. This one's a builder. It's exciting. But then we also have things like actual policies where we have, the need for clients to be segmented, and we might not have the ability to re-architect a network. It can be fun. You can make a lot of money doing that, but not all the time do you actually have the time to go in and start segmenting out like BYOD devices from the corporate owned assets. We might have situations where like a phone can't talk to a PC, and how do we actually do that? And a lot of this research that we started doing came from a lot of questions we got from customers around how do we monitor exposure in our network, look at communications between endpoints. How do we provide multi-tenancy and do things like zero trust networking? And there's a few others on here, but long story short is, how can we use the network to get us to the point of actually trusting communications and being able to control who can communicate with what? And so one of the things that I've been working on for the last couple of years is how we can use the network as a telemetry source and provide context. And so we have a number of tools, and all of this being done through a couple different products we have, like our MXs can do Netflow version 9, and our MS390 and the 9300 in managed mode that we haven't launched just yet can do full ABC Netflow. But we have a lot of different ways that we can capture data, whether it's profiling endpoints and using device fingerprinting and sending that off to like an identity services engine. and as well as things like attaching an SGT to an endpoint and then being able to track, what devices have what tags and then what groups they belong to. And all this kind of falls back into leveraging tools like Cisco ISE and Secure Analytics to be able to define and start looking at the types of traffic that I can actually control. And so one of the things that the first projects I worked on with the MS390 for kind of this focus area was enabling a function under the hood called device sensor, where we can take fingerprinting data about the endpoint connecting like the DHCP information, CDP, LLDP data, as well as HTTP attributes. When you enable accounting for a radius policy on a 390, it enables all of those fingerprinting functions out of the gate. We don't require that you configure anything at all. And all of them are dynamic updates. So if an endpoint changes any state, the operating system changes, we will update those attributes as we go. And then this is the feature I've probably worked on the longest and continuing to work on, which I really appreciate, is adaptive policy. Everyone here familiar with TrustSec by chance? So this is more or less our take on TrustSec and using security group tags within the network. And there's a couple things. Talking about context, the one thing this does give us is the ability to attach context to a client and then actually carry that context over the data plane. So instead of having really costly out-of-band control plane connections that honestly can take seconds, minutes to actually sync, sometimes longer, we are able to, with the data plane, actually transmit all that data about the endpoint, like the group it belongs to, and then be able to actually apply policy different hops within the network.
Is it only inline tagging that you do, or do you do SXP as well?
No SXP today.
Okay.
One of the things we were trying to avoid was some of the scaling concerns that SXP causes. You start getting into a lot of tuning when you with SXP, right? Like you have to make sure that you're not putting every single IP to SGT map to every device, or the cam table is completely hosed. So we don't do SXP today. We have heard people ask for it, but one of the things we're trying to do instead is build out the support for tagging through all of our products so that it's a little easier at least. You don't have to make as many decisions around where to peer things. And the assignment, or the ways we have assignment today for those groups is we can do static port assignment or SSID assignment with our access points. IP prefix to SGT maps if we need to map to anything that's external to the tagging domain, if you will. And then my favorite, which is dynamic via radius, where we can actually use profiling information to attach tags, the user that's signed in, a combination of all of the above, as well as posture state, so that we can actually assign and get this information right on the box.
Is that posture and profiling from the Meraki dashboard or from ISE as well?
It'd be through ISE. Yeah, so one thing I like to do is try to leverage really powerful tools like ISE. And so when I joined actually 7 years ago, I used to deploy ISE all the time, and I've been trying to just keep us working towards more and more integrations, because you can do a lot with that product. But the thing that I find funny is everyone talks about SGTs as if they are just a security feature, but it's also a way to share context, as I was saying. And so we can attach an actual group to an endpoint and then be able to tell a firewall with no other communication, this is an employee device transmitting this traffic. And there's a couple cool things we're working on that I'll get to towards the end, where we have the ability potentially to rubber stamp policies for every site. So you don't have to worry about this site, the employee subnet is VLAN 100 and it's this subnet. Instead, we could just look at the actual tags and use that as our way of applying policy. And as I was saying, with the MS390 specifically and the 9300 in Meraki mode, we also have Netflow and encrypted traffic analytics. We tried to make this as easy as possible and very extensible when you look at the flow record I'm about to pull up in a second. But the way this works is you would enable this feature at the network level, and every single switch port will have the Netflow, AVC Netflow profile attached to it. And so we're able to capture all east-west traffic, north-south, looking at all the communications between endpoints. And the same goes for ETA. So when you enable ETA, it is applied across all the ports. You don't have to go in and select which port you want to enable it, which means that we're able to capture as much information as possible with about 3 or 4 clicks. Now, the actual flow recording is fun. I worked with the Secure Network Analytics team to define this to being the most comprehensive as possible recording config. And that means that we have a lot of standard match statements, including like the nbar application information. But we also have the security group tag we're collecting, as well as, I had to condense all of this down to a couple lines because it was about 25 lines long. But we also try to collect as much information about the connections. So if it's TCP, we're able to look at like the client and server bits and look at the TCP flags, the counters, the observation point in the network, and a lot of really good information so that we're able to tell exactly where the communication started and where it's headed. And then with ETA, I just put this down here, but there's a few fields we collect, like the actual certificate information, so that we can start picking apart that connection without having to decrypt it, because that is also expensive and you lose a lot of performance if you try to do man-in-the-middle decryption. And so once we get to the point of having all that context attached, we can start looking at the actual data and building out a policy. And a lot of that can be done, and this is one of my favorite dashboards in Secure Network Analytics, is the TrustSec report. And the reason I really appreciate it is I'm able to use like human readable groups and see the types of communication that's going between them. And so and I'm going to pull this up in a demo here in a minute, but once you send all the data over to Secure Network Analytics and you do the integration with ICE, you're able to start seeing which groups are talking to which groups, if there's a policy in place. And then you can actually dig into the flows that are being built between them, and you can start looking at how to build a policy. And so I like to refer to this as the informed policy creation, because, not gonna lie, back in the day, we used to do a lot of guesswork, building an access list. You're like, I think this person that I'm going to apply this downloadable ACL, for instance, may not need to talk to a database. And then you find out that they can't do their job because you blocked their access. And so having an actual set of telemetry and data is very handy for that, and not guessing on everything, which is fun. And there's a couple ways we can apply policy. We can go back to the kind of standard ACL-based application. We did add this, I think, like a year and a half ago, but as group policy ACL. We don't have downloadable ACLs with Meraki, but we do have centrally coordinated or orchestrated access lists that you can apply via named ACL, which can work. And I've talked to a lot of customers about why you should layer security. So probably use an ACL with an SGT when you need to have like a macro and a micro policy. But the really cool part about this is that it's all on the fly updates. So when you apply that access list, if you need to change it in dashboard, you change it and it will apply to all the clients connected without a COA required. And when we get into security group-based policies, we do have some limitations around the number of ACLs that can be attached between two groups. But we do scale out pretty well with up to 16 ACE entries and 7 ACLs in each intersect. So you're able to define quite a bit of traffic. We are working on supporting TCP states as well, so that you'll be able to set TCP established, for instance, and be able to have bidirectional traffic without having to build out bidirectional ACLs, which saves a lot of time. Now this is built at the organization level. And so I think one of the biggest complaints I've ever heard from customers is having to go into each and every network to configure a policy or update a policy. And we say API, and that's a decent answer until you don't know how to use them. And then it's a lot of like, I'm not learning Python today, so how am I going to use the API? And so we decided that the best possible way to deploy the policy itself is to do so from the organization level, so that you make that policy configuration once, you turn it on in the network, and then you keep updating it from the same place, and you only have to update it once. So you don't have to go to each and every site and then update the policy and, for instance, change IoT devices to be able to communicate or not communicate between each other. It gives us a lot of power and flexibility. And the really nice part is that it's a configuration update instead of like an on-demand push of some sort of extra policy. So it does maintain state with the configuration. There is an API. I know I just mentioned APIs a minute ago in a semi-negative light, but we built everything with this feature set with an API that is publicly available, so that you are able to build your own applications, if need be, your own policy deployment as necessary. And this is huge. We've actually used this for an ICE integration that I'm pulling up right here. So with ICE 3.2 patch 1, we actually have the ability to maintain policy in ICE. So if you've ever built a TrustSec matrix in ICE, you can actually go in, integrate it with dashboard, and it will push policy up. And it will continue to sync policy as you make changes there. So a lot of customers also have a security team that manage their ICE environment and a network team that manages dashboard. And they don't want to have the security team log into dashboard to potentially mess something up, and vice versa. Network team probably doesn't get in ICE. And so this gives us the ability to set a central place for configuration and just use our APIs to actually sync that policy. And I'm going to show that in a minute too, if I can. And so this is my demo slide, because I'm going to show hopefully something that works. But I've had some connectivity issues today, so bear with me. I do have a video. I hate using videos though, so I'm going to try to make this as risky as possible. All right, so anyone have any questions before I get into this?
Yeah, I'm just curious why you don't use COA. Are there no use cases for it? For example, if I connect to a Meraki device and I get an SGT assigned for it for like 5, and at some point the profiling changes and I need to do a port bounce or of some kind, do you do it through an API or do you,
we
actually
support
use the COA?
We do support COA.
Okay.
The COA piece was on the group policy ACLs. We don't require you use a COA to update that ACL. It will just push down as a configuration. So 100% we support COA. If we didn't, I'd be pretty upset. The only one we don't support is port shutdown. But port bounce, just reauth, disconnect, standard fare, I guess, in that regard. So speaking to adaptive policy, as I said, this is at the organization level. And if I click into here, I'll dig into kind of how we have things set up. So once we get into adaptive policy, we go to the group definition. And so you don't have to have ICE to run this and start testing it out. You don't have to have a Radius server at all. And so we give you the ability to define your SGTs, and we give you up to 60 out of the box. We worked with a number of customers and interviewed a number of folks that had worked with TrustSec, and we found that the number was usually around 30 to 40 that were used in a fairly scalable environment. And anything beyond 40, you get into the same thing you do with ACLs, which is, why do I have all of these? What are all these different groups? And so we kind of limited to 60. We do have plans to extend that well beyond that, but it's a matter of making sure that we don't also overwhelm our access points, which have limited compute and storage and all sorts of things. So once we have our SGTs defined here, we can go out and start building policies. And so when we build a policy, we kind of built this fun UX where you can choose IoT device, and maybe you want to block IoT from a lot of things, maybe most of these. And we give you the ability to either permit, deny, or we have custom. And custom is where I can start adding in the different access lists that I've built. I don't have a number of them built, a few. We might want to permit MQTT. Who doesn't like MQTT? And then we might want to permit DNS, and then just deny the rest. And once I've actually pushed that configuration change through, it usually takes a couple minutes, but that'll push down to all of my sites with the feature enabled, and it will start applying that policy to any of the devices that are applicable to the policy I've set. And so from a dashboard perspective, it can be very self-sustaining. And if some customers, for instance, they just want to have some level of segmentation within a single subnet. But if we have to get into leveraging Radius and ICE, this integration is one that I have fought for many years. But we now have this function under Work Centers and TrustSec for Meraki. And if you haven't seen Thomas Howard demo this, you should. He does a really good job. But the really fun part is that, and I already built the connection. I did record it, but long story short, you just put in the name of the connection, the API key, and then you select the organization. And from there, we get into picking out the things that we're syncing. And so as we define an SGT, we can select it here, and it will sync. I think the default is 5 or 10 minutes that it syncs, so it's not instantaneous, but you can set it down to 5 minutes because I'm impatient. That's exactly how I do it. But if we were to go in and actually build out or add a new SGT, let's see, let's just name this. Let's pick a fun value. What day is today?
7.
Oh, nice. Okay. So once we actually add an SGT, it's as simple as going back into the integrations, choosing the, not that one, that one. Let's see, we have this new one here. You'll notice it's not selected. And just so you believe me, there is no TFDX here, I promise. But we can go ahead and put a check mark, click save, and then go back to sync status. And this is where people like me that don't want to wait can just sync it now. And if I go back here, this is working much quicker now. You'll notice this TFDX here. And so it is very quick. Just uses our APIs. There's no need for any connection back from dashboard to ICE. It's just REST APIs, so it does very straightforward. And as you build out these configurations as well, I should have mentioned, if I was to have attached a policy, it would have also pushed that policy up and added it to the list here. Now, once we, as I was mentioning earlier, like once we start attaching SGTs to endpoints, we don't necessarily have to act on it, and it can be used as context. And when you look at Stealth Watch, you can start, or Secure Network Analytics, you can start doing things like looking at the different group communications. And so this is my small lab environment. You can see there's not a ton of events at all, but I do have a number of things built here. And so this is the TrustSec report functionality. And since we ship not only with the ICE integration, it pulls the SGTs in, but we also ship the SGT as a record in the Netflow packet. We're able to kind of coordinate and align where that traffic came from. And so we look at this one right here. This is a good one. I have a single user that I've decided to quarantine. We can actually start looking at the traffic between like quarantine and network services. And these are arbitrary names. You can name them whatever you want. But these are two groups. Network services is like my DNS server, a DHCP server, and a couple other things. And if I click flow search, this might take a minute, but it starts pulling up the actual flows between those endpoints. And I can click search here and start looking at any of the flows that match this information. So I chose a really good TrustSec value for quarantine to my network services of 20. And we can start seeing the different flows and start seeing the, for instance, you can look at the applications. We could run there's a summary report, and you can see like the top applications that are used between those groups. But we can start using this information to build a policy with actual data. So instead of, I've used this analogy before, like licking your finger, sticking it in the air, saying, okay, let's block everything and just permit HTTPS traffic between these groups. We can actually get in and have actionable data where we can see, like, this is probably important. And if we look at like the amount of traffic, we can start seeing like this is important to this user account or this device that's connected, and start seeing, hey, maybe this user is an employee and they're in sales, and for some reason they are, using services that we never expected. You could interview them and ask them like, hey, we noticed that you've had a lot of traffic. We're building security policies to the server. Like, what do you use it for? And start actually getting actionable insights into what's going on in the network itself.
I have one question regarding the ICE. Beside the synchronization of the text, can you also use, for example, the ICE posture checks and say, I only allow you if you pass my posture check, and then I assign you that tag, otherwise you go to quarantine, and once you have whatever updated, I get you to the user network, things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at most of ICE, it's a radius server, right? And so as long as you support some of the key attributes like URL redirects, applying an ACL to the session itself, we can do COA, and you can change the state if they like failed posture, for instance, over time. And we support all of that. So there's no limitations there.
Also user certificate checks and things like that?
Absolutely. Anything that ICE can do, as long as it can make a radius like call to the box itself, we'll process it and then reapply policy. All right, so I like using this as a demo slide mainly because that's how I feel when people are like, I promise this is real. So tying all of this together though, I actually have a session that I did at this past Cisco Live US with a gentleman by the name of Matt Robertson. And we built out this lab environment where we can kind of build this feedback loop. So one of the really cool things with secure network analytics is you can build policies that match specific behaviors of an endpoint, and then you can trigger changes in the network without actually having to touch it. So if you think like the 2 o'clock in the morning emergency where someone is like data dumping or downloading half the internet, instead of having to wake up and take care of it, you could also just build a policy that matches that kind of behavior and then apply a policy, change it, and block their access to the network or quarantine them. We used a great example of someone trying to talk to servers in Canada, because that's obviously not a good thing. And Matt's Canadian, so it was a lot of fun. But it gives us this ability to kind of build a self-driving network to a degree. I would never say to do this for everything, right? That's a little risky. You never know. It's still, human error can get in the way. But this is something like if you know that you have a situation that you should absolutely block someone from having access to the network or to be able to control their access, you can build this kind of system. It doesn't take a lot of work, I promise. It was actually really weird. I built this out and I went through like a guide. It took me probably 20 minutes and I built a policy that I blocked Canada. And I did not think that was going to be easy at all. I was under the impression this was like terribly difficult and was very happy. So this is one of my favorite aspects of working in Cisco, especially working across products, is that we can start building these integrations and they work really well together. And in this case, like this is something when I demoed it, I had a guy come up to me and say, I had no idea Meraki could do anything like this. I'm like, well, yes, you can. You just have to use the tools in front of you. And so the one thing I want to get back to, though, real quick, is that we are working towards a lot of new things with adaptive policy. We did just introduce in beta support for carrying SGTs over AutoVPN. So if you're familiar with SGTs, without SXP, it's very difficult to have tags be present in multiple networks that are not necessarily connected over like dark fiber or your own infrastructure. And with carrying SGTs over AutoVPN, we can connect as many sites as necessary, have inline tagging, and be able to perform the same level of policy, the same visibility into traffic, no matter how many sites you have. And since we're, not to get into the really nitty-gritty on this stuff, but since we actually apply policy at the destination, we don't have to worry about every single client's or peer's SGT. We can actually just accept traffic in and then either drop, permit, do whatever's necessary, and scale to, potentially hundreds of thousands of endpoints without having to scale up our network necessarily on a site-by-site basis. I like this because the one thing that we did do with adaptive policy was ensure that we used the Cisco metadata header. It is all the same standard functionality. There is nothing different in the way that we implemented inline tagging, so that if you have a multi-domain, if you will, environment that uses SGTs, we can build a trust relationship between them, use ICE to sync that policy, and get that same experience, whether you're attached to a Meraki switch, a Catalyst switch with SDA, just depends on the situation, but you'll get that same control over traffic with the micro-segmentation functionality, et cetera. So looking ahead, we have a number of things that I'm hoping the next Cisco Live I get to talk about. We'll see. Like things like this, where we're going to start trying to bring in like Secure Network Analytics Lite. It'll be light. It's not going to be the full shebang because it's a lot of data to store. But being able to start pulling in like hits between groups and start showing customers a visual representation of that information. Also looking at like hit counters and access. So one of the things we can do is start pulling in event logs and then start showing customers the things that are happening in a little bit more granular detail. Also, bringing in group policy-based assignments. So if you're familiar with group policies in Meraki, you can attach them statically in dashboard. You can pick a client, select the client, and then apply a group policy, and that will follow that client when they connect to wireless in our MXs as well. You can also do that through our API. So I have seen a number of like 10,000 plus site customers that use the API to apply policies because they don't want to necessarily leverage Radius for everything. And so they'll monitor traffic and behavior and then change the group policy assignment. And so this gives us the ability to make, I would say, like, make it easier to start leveraging SGTs without having to involve a Radius server, give you some dynamic behavior as well. And so I'm excited for this just because, like, if you're familiar with our IPSK without Radius on our wireless, you can attach a group policy to a pre-shared key. And this gives us the ability to differentiate that far more. And this is, I'm not going to lie, this is probably one of my favorite ones that I'm pushing the MX team to keep working on, is the ability to use adaptive policy groups to apply different firewall rules. I built out so many firewall policies that were based on Active Directory groups and all sorts of great stuff like that, where there's a lot of work. I don't like Active Directory at all. I really don't. And when I have had to build these out, you have to build this out-of-band connection. The firewall has to go and talk to that Active Directory server, find the new client binding for an IP address, and it's painful. And so this makes it so that we don't have to do that at all. And in fact, at the firewall level, we just make sure the network is sending us tags, and we can start applying really granular policies. This means that you could, as another coworker of mine says, rubber stamp policy across all your sites. So instead of having to define a different ACL at each site and deal with the amount of work that takes, you could just build a policy that says, hey, this IoT device or the IoT devices can only speak to these resources, and we drop anything else. Or maybe it's an employee, an employee group that we need to permit to specific resources and drop access to, like, knownbadsites.com. It's not real, but being able to do that and do that at scale means that we don't have to sit and constantly manipulate things as the network changes, because the IP agnostic nature of SGTs themselves.
Can you just elaborate on the .1x? Yeah, so I have an IoT device. Unfortunately, it cannot take a certificate. So then you would match on a MAC address, I assume. But if you have a full client, you can match on a client certificate and associate this client as belonging to that group. And the groups I need to build completely in Meraki if I don't want to do an AD integration, yeah?
So for the security groups, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, or in ICE. If you're using ICE, you can build in there and sync them up to the dashboard.
Yeah, with AD you said you don't like it. I also don't like it, but often it's convenient because they have already groups. You can just reuse it. Otherwise, if you do it locally on your device, you have to always maintain these groups and who belongs to what group, and that is also kind of a big overhead. Yeah.
Yeah, so like with the way the ICE policies work, you're still like building combinations and conditions that you're matching for an outcome, and so it's not going to be as granular for sure. Like, you're not going to have hundreds of groups that you could potentially map to. But when you think about like a normal like ICE rule, you're going to have like all the different group bits that you want to match, the posture state, any of the other little bits that, well, there's so many of them, but all the hundreds of conditions that you can match with a single outcome. And so in this case, that single outcome could also be a group assignment, for instance. Now, this specifically is to MX. So MX right now is propagating and preserving tags over AutoVPN, but we are working towards the client classification, tagging, and application through all the different normal switch functions, but at the firewall level, so that if you have like an office in a box scenario where you connect your clients to an MX, like, wow, I'm trying to 68, for instance, that has like 12 ports, we could do so and still get SGTs functioning. So,
a last question to that. So I'm expecting on a matching policy an IoT device now shows up, let's say, a full-blown Linux device and is starting doing funky stuff. Can you somehow fingerprint as well, or have some let's say device agnostic thing that you say, okay, this is matching my policy, that is really an IoT device?
Yeah, so with ICE, we could absolutely, I can't remember what it's called right now.
fingerprinting, I think.
Yeah, so when we send the actual fingerprint data up to ICE, like from profiling with device sensor, if that changes, I don't remember what it's called though, but there's a checkbox you can do that says like, if this device changes its like profile significantly, act on it. And it could be that you disconnect it and run it through the auth process again, or you could apply some crazy policy and block them completely from the network and wait.
Ring the alarm bells, send the troops, and so on. Yeah.
Absolutely.